It began with a man no one recognized. He walked into the diner one rainy morning, ordered one coffee, and paid for every stranger inside. No name. No reason. Just a quiet act that left the whole town buzzing. But by the time they learned who he really was, the coffee had gone cold, and their hearts were forever warm. The town of Brighton Hollow never meant to lose its kindness. Just misplaced it. Somewhere between the layoffs at the factory and the new mall by the highway, something in the people hardened. They became practical, efficient, too busy to look each other in the eye. It was the kind of town where politeness replaced warmth and routine replaced community. Doors still opened for strangers, but smiles no longer waited on the other side. The local newspaper had stopped printing years ago. The choir at St. Agnes sang to half-empty pews, and laughter sounded like something borrowed from memory. On the corner of Main Street stood Marla's Diner, a silver building that caught the morning light like a second-hand halo. It had been there for 32 years, serving coffee thick enough to wake a ghost and pancakes that could fix a broken morning. Marla herself was 59, carrying the soft kind of tired that never made it to her voice. Her apron was her armor, her smile her script. Twice divorced, twice rebuilt, and now quietly surviving in a world that had grown allergic to tenderness. She ran the diner with the precision of habit. 6 a.m. she'd unlock the door. By 6:30 the regulars would same faces, the same jokes, the same seats. There was Tommy Haskins, who always complained about the price of gas but never drove less. Mrs. Doolin, who'd lost her husband but never her appetite for gossip. And Earl, the retired postman who still showed up every morning just to check the mail of life, as he called it. They talked about the weather, the taxes, and sometimes about the things they pretended not to miss. But never about themselves. The conversations had become like the wallpaper, comforting because it never changed. Outside, rain tapped the awning like a polite reminder that the world still moved. The windows fogged with breath and coffee steam, blurring the line between inside and out. At 8:42 a.m. the bell above the door chimed. And that was when everything began to change. He stepped inside slowly, shaking the rain from his shoulders as if the weather had followed him. He was tall but not imposing, dressed in a dark coat meant for colder places. The kind of man you'd forget if not for the calm he carried. Like someone who'd made peace with something the rest of us still argued with. The regulars looked up for a second, then went back to pretending they weren't curious. Marla, wiping a counter with the rhythm of someone who's seen every kind of trouble walk through that door, gave him a nod. "Morning, stranger," she said. "Coffee?" He smiled, just enough to be kind without asking for conversation. "Please," he said. "Black." When she brought the cup, steam curling like a secret above it, he pulled out a $20 bill. "And one for everyone else," he added. She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Everyone." He nodded. "Everyone here. Everyone who walks in until the rain stops." The words settled over the room like a hush too delicate to break. Forks paused midair. The sound of the old ceiling fan suddenly seemed too loud. Even the jukebox stuttered into silence, as if waiting to understand what had just been offered. Tommy Haskins leaned back. "What's the occasion?" he asked, half suspicious, half hopeful. The stranger looked out the window where the rain blurred the town into watercolor. "No occasion," he said. "Just coffee." And something in the way he said it made it sound like a prayer. Marla hesitated, studying him. He wasn't local. His hands were too clean, his shoes too new, his eyes too tired. But there was no trick in his voice. No salesman's shine. Just quiet certainty, cup after cup. For Tommy. For Mrs. Doolin. For Earl. For the teenager in the corner booth pretending not to listen. For the mailman who still checked the mail of life. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, thicker, sweeter than usual, as if even the coffee understood something sacred was happening. When she returned to the counter, she found the stranger watching the window, lost somewhere far beyond the glass. He didn't look lonely, just distant, like someone who'd learned to carry both peace and pain in the same pocket. "Rain's supposed to clear by noon," Marla said, trying to make it sound casual. He nodded. "Then you'll have a busy morning." And just like that, a small smile returned to her face, one she hadn't used in months. The hours that followed were unlike any other. Word began to spread. A man buying coffee for everyone. No reason, no name. Just kindness. The diner filled with new faces, construction workers, nurses, students with soaked backpacks. They came for the free coffee, stayed for the atmosphere, and left with something heavier than caffeine. Marla noticed how people lingered. How strangers started talking again. How laughter, awkward at first like a language relearned, began to fill the corners. By 11 the rain was still falling, gentle and patient. The stranger's cup sat half empty beside him, cooling unnoticed. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't checking the time. He just sat there, occasionally jotting something in a small leather notebook. When Marla tried to sneak a glance, he closed it softly, as if protecting a fragile thought. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Just remembering," he said. She wanted to ask what that meant, but the bell above the door chimed again, and the spell of curiosity gave way to routine. It wasn't until much later, after the lunch crowd thinned and the stranger still hadn't left, that she realized she didn't want the rain to stop. It sounded like belonging. And Brighton Hollow, the town that had forgotten how to be kind, was about to remember, one cup at a time. The morning inched forward as if the rain were teaching time to walk slower, and the stranger sat with an ease that belonged more to prayer than to posture. In a town that measured worth by motion, his stillness unsettled and soothed at once. He did not rummage for entertainment, did not tap restless fingers, did not check a glowing screen to confirm he existed. He simply let the room occur around him and accepted his place inside it, like a stone that understands the river will do what it must. Marla watched from the soft theater of the counter, where the metal napkin holder caught window light and turned it into a narrow blade. She had spent a lifetime learning how to read weather on faces. Grief wore its heat high in the cheekbones. Shame kept glancing at the door. Loneliness disguised itself as patience. The stranger carried a combination she had observed only in people who had spent time on the other side of a hard season: quiet without vacancy, sorrow that no longer asked to be named, a gentleness that did not perform. He drank in intervals that obeyed something older than thirst. The room adjusted to him without discussing it. The retired postman began arranging the morning paper sections by habit instead of hoarding the crossword. A high schooler removed one headphone and decided to keep the other in his pocket rather than his ear. Two nurses returning from a night shift stopped pretending they had somewhere else to be. A trucker folded his hands as if to give the table a rest from the weight of his forearms. Nobody could explain the change if asked. They only felt that the volume of living had been turned down until candor could be heard. The bell above the door kept confiding the world to the hinges. In came the carpenter whose thumbs kept the shape of wood even when he washed his hands. In came a woman who used to lead the church choir before Sundays turned into errands. In came a teacher who never stopped holding her breath between semesters. Some arrived under the pretense of weather, others under the pretense of caffeine, all left with the impression that they had encountered an absence that made room for them. When Marla set cups on saucers, she noticed that the stranger thanked in a way that did not require audience. The mouth barely moved, the eyes did the speaking. Gratitude can sound like coins, or it can sound like a doorway quietly closing behind a guest so the warm air will not escape. His sounded like the doorway. He paid each time with bills that had been folded only once, never crumpled, never in a hurry. His hands bore a story the rest of him would not yet tell. A thin pale seam on the inside of the wrist, the kind of line left by a hospital or a fight with bad luck. A faint stain of what might have been motor oil trapped near the nail bed despite careful living. A scar on the second knuckle that had learned patience by healing. He took out the notebook sparingly, as a man lifts a photograph he has promised himself to look upon without breaking. The cover was leather, travel-worn in the corners, the spine softened by weather or confession or both. He wrote in a hand that preferred clarity to flourish. Whatever made its way to those pages traveled there without ornament. Brighton Hollow is an expert at making theories when it cannot make conversation. Theories arrived in the diner on the backs of other people's errands. The barbershop had voted him a missionary of some nameless denomination that likes black coats and untroubled consciences. The pharmacy decided he must be a doctor fallen out of love with medicine but not with people. The hardware store opted for a widower who had inherited more money than sleep. By mid-morning, the grocery clerk was telling anyone who would listen that the stranger looked like someone who had given up arguing with clocks. They were all wrong and all a little right. Grief, purpose, money, surrender. The ingredients of mystery rarely change, only the recipe does. Marla refused to name him anything but what he had brought. Quiet, He had ordered it with the coffee and somehow the town drank that too. She kept moving, but the movement had lost its performative edge. The rag near her fingers had always been a shield. Now it was just a rag. She paid attention to the small mathematics of kindness unfolding on her floor. A pair of teenagers, enemies by rumor and indifferent by habit, slid their feet under the same booth and discovered their knees could brush without their pride catching fire. A nurse who hadn't had a proper laugh in 7 days let it escape, startling herself, then apologizing to no one in particular for the optimism. The retired postman who used to carry other people's love letters in a bag, he pretended was only a bag, began telling a story about the time 2 blue envelopes changed a woman's summer. Stories are bridges. The town remembered how to cross. By 10 the windows were a soft mirror. Outside, Brighton Hollow performed its weekday chores with due diligence. Inside, the diner practiced the old craft of being a room where people can put down what they do and remember who they are. The coffee refilled and refilled, and the stranger nodded the way a lighthouse nods, barely moving, entirely present. He sometimes lifted his gaze to the corner table where a mother with working hands helped her child divide a pancake into 8 equal contritions. He sometimes listened to the booth where 2 city workers negotiated a truce between a broken crosswalk and the appetite of traffic. He sometimes examined his own reflection in the stainless steel napkin dispenser, and then looked away as if to remind himself that he was not what the metal declared. He did not wander. A man can travel far without standing up. Marla tried every old trick she had learned over decades to place him on a map. People wear clues like unbuttoned collars. Watches reveal the country of one's priorities. Shoes keep diaries of the ground they have obeyed. Wedding rings confess, even when turned in toward the palm. The stranger's watch was simple, not cheap, the face clean, the strap replaced at least once by someone who understands wear. The shoes were new in the way a person buys new shoes when he has decided to start walking again. The ring finger carried no band, but there was a shallow pale circle that declared absence as loudly as presence ever had. The rain lifted and resumed in drifts, as if the sky could not decide whether to insist or relent. The promise he had made, coffee for everyone until the rain stopped, became elastic like an oath spoken to a friend you hope will take advantage of you. He kept buying when the sky forgot to fall for several minutes, kept buying when the light flared on the slick street and then softened again. People noticed and chose not to point it out. Mercy is best left unmeasured in public. Around noon, a girl from the high school came in with damp hair, and the sort of backpack that makes a spine older than it ought to be. She carried a journal not unlike his, cheap cardboard for a cover, the spine already cracked from confession. She sat alone and pretended to study a page that had become a place to stare. The stranger watched her not the way a person watches a person, but the way a person watches a season, acknowledging change without demanding explanation. Later, when she left, he would open his notebook as if to rescue something that had almost drowned. The diner learned his silence and began speaking in its margins. Someone paid for a slice of pie and left a second slice untouched in a takeout box with a note that said, in handwriting untrained but sincere, for the man who buys the air. The note never reached him because Marla could not bring herself to flatten a mystery with gratitude. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron where she kept the family ring that no longer fit her finger. He rose only once, to step outside the door where the awning caught the rain and tried to be a gentle hand. He looked toward the end of the street where the mill used to exhale a tired pride. The sign was still there in faded letters, a name that remembered itself but not the men who had worn it into their jackets. He drew a breath that seemed to negotiate with the distance between a town and its disappointment. Then he returned to the booth, leaving only the smell of wet wool and a sense that the weather had finished a sentence on his behalf. The waitress who covered Tuesdays and the occasional grief arrived, late because her car had decided to register an opinion. She stopped short when she saw the full room and the way the sound sat in it, conversation without performance, laughter unafraid to end, chairs scraping without irritation. She moved differently. People move differently when they suspect they have not been abandoned by the day. Marla kept the register open longer than necessary, as if she were airing out an old bruise. The till filled in ways she did not expect. Free coffee turned into heavy tips from people who had not tipped well in years. Some gave not out of obligation but out of relief of having been given a reason to be generous that did not sound like a sermon. Money remembers what hands do with it, The bills looked briefly younger as they changed direction. The stranger's quiet radiated into corners where even paint cannot reach. At the end of the counter, a man who had once been a coach of boys who never learned to pass the ball sat upright and let the years lay down. He had been hard longer than necessary because hardness wears the mask of stewardship in small towns. Now, with the stranger's silence chewing the room into softer pieces, he allowed his jaw to unclench. He noticed the ache at the hinge and forgave himself for it. He thought of the boy he had benched one October because Mercy had not yet won its election in him. He took out his phone and typed the boy's name and found the number through a series of small courage steps that felt like crossing an iced-over creek one stone at a time. He did not call yet, but the day had made space for the eventual ring. Brighton Hollow is a place that dislikes spectacle but adores ritual, and somewhere between 11 and 1 the ritual began. The first person who would have paid for her own coffee with coins that kept an anxious appointment with the bottom of her purse found that her hand did not need to open. The second person who had planned to decline out of principle discovered that principle can be pride in its Sunday clothes. The third person who wanted to apologize for accepting realized that apology is not the language of gifts. Marla observed all of it and allowed the town to practice being beloved. The stranger studied the bulletin board near the door. There were flyers for lost cats that had most likely found other kitchens, a guitar teacher whose patience cost less than a haircut, an invitation to a grief group that met on Thursdays in the basement of a church that still rang bells for weddings and a few funerals. He looked longest at the photograph of a little league team taken the year the mill closed, boys holding bats as if to splint something broken in their fathers. His face did not change. A muscle near his eye considered tense and then decided against it. By early afternoon the air outside had begun its negotiations with spring. The rain weakened to a mist that felt like breath more than weather. The stranger did not call an end to his promise. He kept nodding when Marla raised an eyebrow to see if the sky had relieved him of duty. He had committed to the hush. He would not break it with arithmetic. In the booth behind him, a man with a ledger for a heart counted aloud the ways he had been wronged by taxes, by neighbors who parked poorly, by a world that had ceased to admire his common sense. The stranger's quiet did not scold. It simply existed until the ledger man heard his own voice and recognized that he did not like its taste. Complaint is a flavor that dulls even its owner. He let his list return to his pocket like a bird returning to its insufficient nest. He looked around, saw that nobody had been keeping score with him, and exhaled the stubborn breath that had been standing guard over nothing. Meanwhile, the girl with the backpack returned, as students will, because habit and hunger and the need to be seen by a room that will not interrogate you are compelling teachers. She ordered nothing she could not afford and then remained with the half hour she had stolen from an afternoon that intended to spend her on else. The stranger did not watch her. He noticed her the way a tree notices wind, a conversation that does not require grammar. When she left, he opened the notebook and wrote a line that Marla later read without meaning to when she wiped the table. A name, a date, an arrow pointing forward as if to remind himself that arrows do not mean fate, only direction. Around 2, a delivery driver brought in a stack of cardboard that would eventually hold pies pleased to be chosen. He complained to the air out of habit, then saw the room, then remembered he had nothing to add that would not disturb the surface of the calm. He left quieter than he arrived. Outside, his truck coughed and then apologized by idling without fuss. Marla, who owned more weariness than furniture, found that her feet hurt less when the sound of the diner stayed under a certain height. The stranger had set that bar without setting it at all. She thought of the years she had spent manufacturing personality for rooms that wanted spectacle. She thought of the marriages that had asked her to keep proving she was grateful, and the divorces that had asked her to keep proving she was sorry. This day asked nothing but participation. She poured, she wiped, she nodded, and in the intervals between tasks she allowed the idea to visit that she might be permitted to be a person rather than a function. It did not stay long, ideas seldom do on a workday, but it left a forwarding address. A man in a suit that did not fit the town came in with shoes that had not been introduced to puddles. He carried a briefcase like a shield and surveyed the room the way one surveys potential clients, determining where return on investment might be hiding in the sugar caddy. He tried to insert his voice into the atmosphere, discovered there was no room for his pitch in a place practicing reverence, and took a seat with the expression of someone who has walked into the wrong church and decides to stay anyway because music is music. He drank the coffee he had not intended to order and left a tip that suggested he had understood at least one clause of the unwritten contract. Take what is given. Multiply it before you send it back into the world. The stranger's presence changed how people touched objects. The sugar jar was passed hand to hand instead of slid down the counter like a puck. The creamer found its way to the left without clatter. Plates returned to the dish bin without a small ruin of crumbs. He had not said a word to ask for any of it. He had only declined to hurry. In that afternoon drift when towns grow transparent and show the bones under their routines, the door opened to a woman who had sworn she would never come back after her husband died in the corner booth that still hosted his shadow. Grief is territorial. It does not like sharing rooms. She stood just inside the threshold and measured the day with her eyes, preparing to retreat if sorrow raised its hand. The stranger looked up, not at her but at the booth that had become a memorial to a conversation interrupted. He placed his palm flat on the table in front of him for a breath's length, as if to say that tables remember pressure, and then removed it, leaving nothing but the suggestion that remembering can be a form of company. She crossed to a seat 3 places away from the site of her undoing and ordered tea because grief, too, can learn a new beverage. The rain finally sincerely considered stopping. The light sharpened, separated itself from the gray, and tried on the street like a dress that had been on layaway. Drops still fell from the awning in evenly spaced decisions. People checked the window with the superstition of farmers. The stranger did not look up. He finished the last of his coffee and set the cup down with the respectful weight of a book being closed at a page worth returning to. Marla understood that a hinge in the day had clicked. She approached with the rag she used as punctuation and the smile she saved for changes of scene. The register had never held so much weather. The stranger met her halfway as if to spare her the steps and set several bills on the counter face up, a small kindness to the eyes. She told him, with the courtesy of someone narrating the obvious, that the sky had declared recess. He nodded as if consenting to be relieved of command. Then he did something that made the room lean forward without moving. He left an additional stack, enough to cover not only the cups already promised but the ones Hope might order now that rain had gone to fix itself. He stood there a moment longer, not lingering, not hurrying the way a good sentence allows silence to land on both sides of it. He took in the faces, the regulars who had become less defended, the strangers who had become less strange, the child who had become a person in the eyes of the room, the grief that had sat down without needing a loud chair. He let the weight of that inventory settle into him. Then he turned toward the door, and the bell rehearsed farewell. On the table where he had been, he left the leather notebook long enough for Marla to notice but not long enough for Panic to consider theft. She reached it in 3 steps, meaning only to keep it safe, and the cover, buttersoft at the edges, fell open at a page whose ink had not yet decided whether to be wet or memory. She did not read so much as receive what her eye could not help but catch. A list of towns, each with a date and a single word after it: mercy, repairs, choir, forgiven, garden, home. Next to Brighton Hollow he had written a word she wanted to earn and feared she could not. Remembered. She closed the book quickly, not because the words were fragile but because she wanted them to remain true. When she looked up, he was already outside beneath the new light, hair damp, coat holding the outline of rain. He glanced once toward the mill, once toward the church steeple that had gone on ringing even when nobody answered, once toward the hill where the orchard used to give the town its October. Then he walked the way people walk when they have decided to depart without disappearing. Afternoon resumed its post. The diner released a breath the room didn't know it had been holding. Nobody clapped. Nobody announced lessons. What had moved through them did not require endorsement. The cups continued to refill at ordinary prices now, and yet generosity did not snap shut with the register. A young man paid for an old man's sandwich without turning it into a headline. A woman boxed half her pie and delivered it across the room to the choir director emerita, whose voice still hummed in her chest. The retired postman asked the waitress about her car, and before she could lie, he handed her the name of a mechanic who owed him a kindness. The ledger man took out his complaints and then put them back, deciding to spend them more slowly. In the late hour when the sun tries to convince tired people that golden means anything more than end-of-day light, Marla stood at the door and turned the sign to closed with the sense that the word no longer deserved capital punishment. The floor smelled of coffee and weather and relief. The counter would require its nightly absolutions. The till would need counting. The tables would hold their small rings of history. She pocketed the note the girl had left and placed the stranger's notebook in the locked drawer alongside the apron pin she wore on holidays, her father's pocketknife that could not cut modern twine, and the photograph of herself at 19 when she had not yet agreed to perform. Brighton Hollow's evening arrived like a verdict turned into a promise. The sky finally kept the rain, and the road bled itself dry. People returned to their houses with the residual dignity of those who have witnessed an unadvertised sacrament. Windows lit. Dogs announce follow-up thoughts to the day. The church bells practice believing they could still be useful. In kitchens where conversation had devolved into inventory, someone mentioned that the coffee had tasted different and was surprised when the others agreed. In living rooms where the television had replaced both lullaby and lull, someone reached for the remote and then did not press the button because the silence did not frighten them. On porches where rust had become part of the furniture, someone discovered that the evening air did not hurt as much as it had last week. This is how a town heals. Not by ceremony, but by the accumulation of tolerable moments. Marla stood alone in the emptied diner and felt the size of the room change inside her memory. She rested both palms against the counter the way a woman might brace herself before accepting a truth she has asked for. She thought about the notebook entry and the risky generosity of a single word. Remembered. The opposite of forgetting is not always recalling. Sometimes it is choosing to carry. Had the town carried itself today in a way that permitted a stranger to write that word? She did not know. She only knew that something had been returned to them, the way a tide returns a glimmering thing it could have kept. She turned off the lights one by one, letting each fixture say its soft amen. Out on Main, the asphalt held the last brightness. She locked the door, listened to the bell's small remark, and tucked the key back into the pocket that also held the folded napkin she would not read until tomorrow. The night placed its cool hand on her cheek. Somewhere down the block a porch chair agreed with gravity. Somewhere up the hill a window closed with the finality of a chapter end. A stranger had ordered quiet and the town, surprised to discover it was thirsty for it, had drunk. In homes and hallways and in a few hearts that had boarded themselves against weather, the hush lingered like the smell of morning bread. The man without a name had left the day without a scar, and yet everyone touched it as if to confirm it would not disappear with sleep. The rain had stopped. The coffee had cooled. The kindness had not. The ledger man would call the benched boy before the week ended. The nurse would go back to nights and discover she did not dread them as fiercely. The girl with the backpack would write a poem about a booth in a storm and hide it between the pages of a math book that deserved better. The choir woman would hum at the sink, and the note would lift, and she would believe herself again. A stranger had placed a hand on the town without touching it, and the imprint would keep. And far down the road where darkness gathers its edges, a man walked at the pace of someone who has given away a portion of himself, and found that subtraction made him larger. He would stop at a motel that did not know how to pronounce tender, open the notebook to the page where the town's name waited, and press his palm to the word he had written. He would owe no one an explanation. He would sleep and dream of a counter that smelled like a second chance, and in the dream he would hear a bell above a door announce that another morning had found a room willing to begin again. By mid-afternoon the town had begun to invent a vocabulary for what was happening, because Brighton Hollow has never been good at letting a mystery stand alone. The story left Marla's diner the way steam leaves a cup, quiet, inevitable, curling into corners it was not invited to, making everything briefly warmer than it planned to be. The barbershop heard first, as barbershops do because hair collects snooze. By the time the first clump settled like gray snow near the chair, the tail had already grown a second coat. A stranger had bought everyone coffee, and he was still sitting there, and the rain kept him on duty by refusing to end. Scissors rose and fell in time with speculation. Men in capes nodded like judges. Someone remembered a traveling evangelist from '98 who made the town cry. Someone else said this felt different. No stage, no promise, no bucket at the door. Just a man insisting that mornings could be loosened from their fear. The pharmacy was next. Rumor is fond of aisles. Between cough syrup and kindness the story stretched. The clerk told an old man who came in for blood pressure medicine that he didn't have to pay for his coffee if he went now, but he did have to be ready to accept it without apology. It turned out accepting is a muscle, and the old man discovered he hadn't exercised it in years. He went anyway, shuffling faster than his dignity liked, a small private race against whatever had kept him from pleasure all this time. At the post office, soft authority pulled at the counter as if the government had learned to smile. The clerk stamped envelopes with a rhythm learned in livelier times and said that the diner had become something like a good church, people arriving late and acting as if they had always belonged. A woman mailing a package to her son in a distant city asked whether it was too late to catch the rain's generosity. The clerk didn't know but said the cloud line looked loyal. She went. The package could wait an hour. The soul could not. Schoolchildren heard in fragments. A civics teacher mentioned community as if it were not a word but a door, and told them there was a field trip worth taking 2 blocks away if their feet remembered how to be quiet. She could not leave her class, but a rumor is a permission slip in the right hands. 3 seniors snuck out and returned calm, as if a secret had chosen them in return for the slight misbehavior. They didn't brag. They just sat straighter and finished their assignments with the care of people who suspect a day might be asked to testify on their behalf. Back at Marla's, the receipts grew into a paper weather pattern. They slipped out of the register and made a drift under the till, a small snowfall of proof that kindness had transacted itself through ordinary systems. Marla kept each slip as carefully as if it were a petition. She lined them under a magnet shaped like a cherry pie, then another and another, until the side of the icebox resembled a patchwork quilt made from the cloth of paid, and no charge and enjoy. She didn't yet know she was making an archive. She only knew that when the day ended, she would not want anyone to tell her it had been a dream. The stranger remained in the corner booth near the window, the booth that always made patrons look like they were thinking about leaving even when they had decided not to. He wrote sparingly, then paused for long stretches as if waiting for his own words to catch up. When asked for a name, he offered a sentence instead, delivered the way one delivers a coat to a rack. Names can distract from what matters. The line took a seat in the town's ears and began traveling without luggage, changing slightly each time. Names aren't the point. It's not about names. Forget the name, remember the act. Before long, it was no longer his line. It was theirs, a collective permission to stop interrogating and start receiving. He watched the parade of ordinary miracles without comment. A roofer with a hand the size of a shovel eased a baby's carrier onto the floor while the mother blew on her coffee and practiced loving herself for 10 seconds. 2 teen boys who had not spoken since an autumn argument over a girl they both thought was a future found themselves sharing a plate of fries because the booth had forgotten the old map and drawn a new one that did not include battlefield lines. A hospice nurse sat with her back not to the wall but to the window, trusting a room for the first time in months. Across from her, a woman who ran the church thrift store pressed a folded 5 into the nurse's palm and said with her eyes that this was not payment, that gratitude does not wear price tags. The weather held steady like a loyal sentence. The stranger's quiet held steady like punctuation. And out of that combination the town began to change its posture. An out-of-towner wandered in with a phone camera held low and a curiosity held high. He filmed the room the way tourists film suffering they intend to post later when they need to look like they've understood something. The lens found the stranger, then panned to the receipts, then to Marla's hands as she refilled a cup without asking. The out-of-towner whispered to a follower who wasn't there about random acts and wholesome content. A teenager from the corner table lifted his chin in that slow, protective way small towns used to defend their sacred things from harvesters. The stranger didn't scold. He simply set his notebook down as if to make a sound only good manners can hear. The phone returned to a pocket. The day stayed intact. People with ledgers for hearts tested the math and found themselves unable to be scandalized by generosity that refused credit. They tried to calculate the cost per head, the cumulative outlay, the return in gratitude units. They ran out of columns. A man who used to keep unpaid debts as trophies paid his neighbor's bill, and then stayed to watch the field where resentment had grown go fallow. He carried home an emptiness that did not hurt. The police cruiser eased by once, twice, uncertain what complaint it might be required to answer. The officer inside had learned for years to treat noise as the first symptom of trouble. He lowered his window and listened. The sound was the opposite of an emergency. Chairs accepting legs, spoons agreeing to be spoons, conversation wearing no mask. He moved along, the radio at his shoulder whispering other burdens, his hand on the wheel less tense than it had been an hour before. Outside, The barbershop opened the door and sent a free cut to a boy who had not owned a first day of anything haircut in a year. Across the street, the bakery slid 2 unsold loaves into a paper bag and left it beside the diner's door with a note the bag's intended would never need to read aloud to understand. A woman whose job title had always folded her into other people's earnings called her sister, and said she suddenly believed again in the trivial magic of a shared cup. And could they practice that this weekend? Marla found a rhythm between refilling and receiving. Every few minutes, she stood still for a beat and let the room right itself on her. The beats accumulated into a music that did not need an instrument. When the girl with the backpack returned for an afternoon appearance, Marla slid a slice of pie toward her and looked away, letting the gesture be the entire sentence. The girl closed her eyes after the first bite and remembered that sweetness need not apologize for itself. She took out her small cardboard journal and tucked inside it the torn corner of a napkin on which she wrote nothing at all, because some moments ask to be carried as blankness the future will write upon more honestly than the present could. The stranger watched the ledger wall of the world go soft around the edges. If he kept account of anything, no one saw him do it. He seemed to tally only breath. When Marla passed by with a damp rag that had become an extension of the air, he lifted his cup in a small salute and returned to the page. On the open sheet, a list of names was growing, not of people he had met that day but of towns he had entered and left without sound, each with a single word written after it as a verdict. Mended. Braver. Awake. Today's name waited bare beside a tiny blank square. The space a rule he'd made for himself. Never name a thing before it has a chance to name itself. He had the look of a man who had traveled not to escape but to return, though to what remained unclear. The hinge of his mouth confessed a fluency in apology. The brow carried the softness soldiers wear years after the battle has left their uniforms but not their mornings. He did not touch his phone, not because he was proud of not touching it, but because the small screen could not hold what the room kept handing him. By 3, the receipts had become a minor sculpture, paper curls lifted by the faint indoor wind of door and conversation. A kid who liked order stacked them by time. Not because anyone asked but because purpose is delicious. Marla let him, then taught him the tiny trick of aligning the corners with a tap against the counter. He smiled at the competence, a sip of dignity that had nothing to do with grades. At the edge of town, the mill sat like a closed book that had once been read aloud by fathers who smelled of metal and sleep. Men who used to drive forklifts drifted toward the diner, as if a whistle had sounded in a language that doesn't move machines anymore but still moves men. They sat together and shared the way dogs share shade, without comment, with precision. Free coffee does not heal the economy, it heals something the economy forgets to count. A certain accusing silence went quiet. The choir director emerita arrived wearing a coat that had dressed 3 generations for graduations and graves. She stood under the bell for a heartbeat too long, then entered with the courage of someone visiting an old friend who had behaved badly but might be forgiven. She ordered tea and took the same booth as always and waited. The stranger did not turn to look, yet everything near him adjusted to accommodate the memory she carried. She lifted the cup with both hands, as if to keep it from running away, and her mouth found again the shape of gratitude. Later, she would go home and stand at the sink and hum a note the room thought it had forgotten. The note would find a wall to resonate against and then a throat to live in. Not today perhaps, but soon. On the river bridge a few blocks away, water rehearsed the art of making do with the banks it had been assigned. A boy who practiced being invisible at home leaned over the railing and counted the lives he had imagined but never named. A jogger passed and offered a nod that did not require him to return it. He went to the diner and discovered he had been expected all along. He did not know how to accept the cup, but the cup knew how to accept him. In a house on the hill, a widow found the jar of coins she had been slowly feeding with the intent to leave town someday for a beach that would forgive her with salt. She shook the jar and listened to the clatter of little futures. Then she paused, returned it to the shelf, put on her shoes, and walked down to Marla's not to spend the coins but to spend her company. She arrived and the room made space for her in a way that doesn't look like making space, just a gentle shift in bodies so hers would not have to edge against a table. She sat, and the stranger's quiet allowed her to think of her husband without building a shrine that blocked the door. The afternoon drifted toward a loosened evening. Outside, the rain thinned into a rumor of itself, then returned, then thinned again. This guy had a habit of rehearsing conclusions before consenting to them. Inside, the stranger lifted his cup and set it down with the courtesy of a man who knows cups have memories too. He tore a page from the back of his notebook with careful hands, folded it once, then slid it under the base of the cup so the ring of moisture would not bloom on the table's surface. He cared for the wood as one cares for a thing that has hosted many small resurrections. At some point, a man with too eager a grin tried to buy the stranger a meal in return, eager to discharge the debt he believed he was accruing by accepting. The stranger shook his head. No theatrics, no righteousness. Only that slight lift of the palm that says, "Thank you, but let this be what it is." The eager man sat back, puzzled and a little relieved, learning that gratitude can be quieter than settling accounts. He stayed longer than planned, and by the time he left, he had forgotten which grievance he had brought with him. One of the boys who sometimes skateboard behind the grocery store crept in with shoulders bent into a shape learned from teachers and sidewalks. He looked like shoplifting even when he was doing nothing but existing. Marla set a glass of water in front of him without flourish, then a cup, then a plate with a small sandwich that claimed to be an accident of too much ham. He blinked at it the way wild animals blink at kindness. The stranger, eyes still on the window, shifted the salt shaker toward the boy as if to say flavor belongs to you as well. The boy ate in movements so small he did not interrupt the air. When he finished, he arranged the plate and cup and napkin into a geometry resembling an apology and slid out the door with less stealth than he had entered. The bell marked both passages with the same tone, as if to teach him equality. The receipts multiplied to the point of comedy, and laughter finally loosened its tie. Someone started telling a story about the winter of '03 when the river learned to walk and the town tried to follow. Someone else argued that it had been '04, and promptly proved themselves wrong by confessing details only remembered by liars who wished to be caught. The stranger's presence kept the argument from becoming a contest. They were not trying to win. They were trying to be near the single fact that there had been a winter and a river and a town, and that this was still that town. Toward the edge of daylight, when windows begin to believe in lamps again, the rain released its hold in earnest. The street shone without falling water to decorate it. Tires hissed with relief. A child looked up, noticed the change, tugged a sleeve and pointed. The room, as one animal, realized that the clause attached to generosity had concluded, until the rain stops. The stranger noticed last, or pretended to, or simply chose to let the town discover it first as a way of saying that gifts do not belong to givers once they are given. He reached into his coat and set a few more bills on the counter, not for drama but for completion. Marla met his eyes and found there the same mild storm she had observed that morning had softened into weather that might pass overnight. She didn't thank him out loud because language is sometimes too small and sometimes too loud. Instead, she pressed her thumb on the topmost bill, leaving a faint half-moon where the flour and coffee of the day stamped themselves on currency to make it real. The stranger stood, the coat falling into place as if it knew this was its work. He glanced around the room, at the choir woman's hands resting open on her cup, at the nurse's eyes that had turned from guarded windows into doors on a hinge, at the boy with ham still learning to trust the existence of ham, at the girl with the cardboard journal now closed over a blank worth saving, at Marla, who had set herself down inside the day the way a person sits in a pew without prejudice against prayer. He let the inventory settle, then placed his palm briefly on the table, an unofficial benediction. If anyone tried to stop him for a name this time, they didn't pursue it when he smiled that soft refusal that is not rejection but respect for proportions. He stepped to the counter as if approaching a confessional and asked with his eyes if there was anything else that needed paying that could be paid. Marla tilted her head toward Earl. The retired postman, who had quietly discovered his wallet, had taken the day off without telling him. The stranger took care of it with the delicacy of someone returning a library book. He did not make eye contact with Earl because pity works the eyes too hard. Instead, he rubbed at the seam on his wrist, perhaps without noticing, as if the skin remembered its own bill. On the table, beneath the cup, beneath the fold of paper he had strategically placed to protect the wood, another napkin waited, ink drying itself into permanence. He had written the smallest sermon and weighted it with a 20 as if to ensure wisdom would not be bussed away with the plates. The words would not be seen until after the door had rehearsed his exit, because timing is a craftsman and he respected crafts. He reached for the notebook, then paused, then left it, on purpose or not only he knew. He took a step toward the door, then another. The bell performed its small, reliable music. Outside, the rainless air lifted like a curtain, revealing the same town arranged with new stitching. He moved down the sidewalk with the gait of a man who has learned to trust an ending, shoulders squared to receive whatever the road would hand him next. Inside, the room held its breath the way a congregation holds the last note. Marla stood in the stillness. She noticed the cup, the fold of paper, the weight of cash, the absence. She lifted the cup and found the napkin beneath, creased once, taught how to be important by the smallest ink. She did not unfold it yet. She put it on the counter beside the register, atop the sculpture of receipts, and placed a palm over it the way a person calms an animal that has been surprised by kindness. Around her, dishes began to speak again. Forks resumed their domestic percussion. The hush did not break. It evolved into ordinary volume, the way a bird takes its first hop after landing, not to leave but to prove it knows how. People stood to go, cheeks softer, spines less argumentative, wallets not thinner so much as better instructed. They left tips they hadn't planned to. They held doors for no reason other than the ancient sensation that doors prefer to be held. On Main Street, storefronts looked briefly younger in the new light. The barbershop swept hair into a pile shaped exactly like a human head's past. The pharmacy closed a register and opened a mouth to say goodnight with color. The post office snapped rubber bands around stacks that would be tomorrow. In the houses up the hill, people placed their keys in bowls and their day on tables and let a new pattern propose itself. Talk first, television later. Marla finally unfolded the napkin. 8 words weighted with the confidence of a truth that has already lived elsewhere and knows it can live here too. You all forgot how good it feels to care. She read it once, then again, then allowed herself to sit, breaking a personal rule about closing routines. She thought of the receipts pinned to cold white rumors of kindness becoming records. She thought of the stranger's page with spaces after towns where verdicts belonged. She looked at Brighton Hollow not as a place she worked but as a word she might someday write next to a sentence that healed her. Remembered. Braver. Awake. Mended. She did not choose yet. She let the day whisper its own caption. The bell chimed once more for the last customer, Earl shuffling out with mail only he would deliver, notes to himself about the gentleness of coffee. When the door shut and the echo finished its circle, Marla picked up the notebook he had left. The cover was warm from proximity to breath. Inside, the list of towns hummed in her hands, a low music of elsewhere. She turned to the latest page. There, below the grid he had drawn across the afternoon, the square beside Brighton Hollow remained open, a small awaiting. She closed the book carefully and laid it atop the napkin as if to introduce them. On the far side of the glass, the stranger had already turned the corner. He would become a rumor again, then a story, then a lesson that did not show off its teacher. Behind him, the town lined up its small plates and began the slow, holy work of washing what had served them, not to erase the evidence, but to make it ready for the next meal. Night would come, and with it the scrubbing, the counting, the solitary conversation with a room that has hosted many vows and broken as few as it could. The napkin would be tucked into a drawer, the notebook into a safer one. The receipts would remain visible, proof that grace can be itemized without being cheapened. And in sleep, Brighton Hollow would argue with itself in the old way about whether one cup can change a town. Some would say no. Others would say it already had. Most would dream of the sound the bell made when a man without a name left them alone with a better version of themselves and trusted them to keep it company. When morning returned, Marla would unlock the door at 6, as she always had. She would flip the sign and turn the lights, and the room would wake with a stretch. She would brew a fresh pot and wonder if coffee could remember, then decide that she could remember for it. She would pin the napkin to the wall behind the register with a tack that had previously held up a calendar that never got the days right anyway. She would place the notebook in a drawer and, against her own instincts, keep the drawer unlocked. She would wait. Not for him. For what he had started. And she would not have to wait long. The rain ended like a curtain's final sigh, and with it, something invisible shifted inside the bones of Brighton Hollow. The clouds thinned, revealing a muted sun, pale as an old coin. The world outside looked washed, streets glistening with the kind of cleanliness that can't be bought, only bestowed. Inside Marla's diner, the air was thicker than steam, soft with wonder and disbelief. The stranger was gone. No one saw him leave. No door creaked farewell. No bell offered its usual parting sound. He had simply evaporated between one breath and the next, leaving behind only the faint scent of rain, a half-empty cup, and a napkin folded like a secret waiting to be read. Marla stood behind the counter long after he'd disappeared, her eyes fixed on that square of paper beneath the $20 bill. The note seemed to hum. People pretended not to notice it, but their gazes kept orbiting toward it, drawn by some magnetic pull that only kindness creates. The stranger's absence was louder than any presence the diner had ever hosted. When she finally picked it up, she did so gently, the way you'd lift something alive. Ink was slightly blurred where steam had kissed it. 8 words, simple and almost shy, but they seemed to look back at her as she read them aloud in a whisper. You all forgot how good it feels to care. The diner fell silent. Even the old ceiling fan hesitated. The words seemed to hang in the air like incense, unseen but impossible to ignore. Tommy Haskins, who'd never been sentimental about anything except his truck, cleared his throat as if trying to excuse his sudden stillness. Well, he muttered. Guess he's got a point. Mrs. Doolin, gossip queen of Brighton Hollow, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, pretending there was something in them. I used to bring cookies to the firehouse every Christmas, she said softly, half to herself. Stopped after my bill passed. Didn't seem worth the fuss. Earl, the old postman, reached for his coffee. Maybe fuss is what keeps the heart from rustin', he murmured, the words trembling like loose mail in his throat. Marla folded the napkin again and slipped it into her apron pocket like a relic. She could feel it there, pressing against her hips, small, warm, and impossibly heavy. She didn't realize it then, but that napkin would become the hinge on which the entire town turned. That night, Marla locked the diner later than usual. The rain had stopped, but its memory still clung to the air. She stepped outside, the neon sign buzzing above her, Marla's Diner. Since 1989. The letters flickered like old hope. Across the street, the barber switched off his light. Somewhere in this, a train wailed, long and mournful, as if mourning something it never got to carry. Marla looked up at the bruised sky. She thought of the man, the stranger who had arrived with quiet eyes and left without ceremony, and wondered where he'd gone. Who are you? She whispered into the night. And what are we supposed to do with what you left behind? The question hung in the dark, unanswered but not ignored. By morning, the napkin's words had already begun their pilgrimage. It started small. A mechanic named Lewis stopped by the diner early, his boots tracking in dust from the road. He ordered his usual black coffee, no sugar, and left a 10 instead of a 5. Pay for whoever's next, he said, shrugging off the gesture like lint. An hour later, a florist named June, who'd once sworn never to give away another bloom after her shop went bankrupt, showed up carrying a bundle of tulips. She placed them by the diner's window without a word. For the place that smells like hope again, she said, and left before Marla could thank her. By noon the town was whispering. People who hadn't spoken in years were bumping into each other with awkward smiles, as though remembering that silence had never suited them. The barbershop offered free trims for anyone carrying a heavy day. The grocery store clerk slipped an extra apple into a child's bag. Even the preacher at St. Agnes changed his Sunday sermon. You don't need a pulpit to preach, he said. Sometimes all it takes is a cup of coffee. At Marla's Diner, something remarkable began to unfold. A chalkboard appeared near the door with a new heading scrawled in loopy handwriting. The coffee chain, keep it going. Beneath it, names began to bloom like wildflowers. Paid by Lewis, mechanic. Paid by June, florist. Paid by someone who just wanted to see you smile. The list grew faster than Marla could wipe it clean. Food, they came for the feeling. To be part of something small and sacred, something unadvertised. The Strangers Act had cracked something open in the town. Earl started leaving stamped envelopes on tables, encouraging people to write letters again. Emails don't smell like ink, he said. Letters remember the hand that held them. Mrs. Doolin began bringing extra cookies to the firehouse, humming while she baked. He was right, you know, she told Marla one afternoon. Caring does feel good. Like I'd forgotten how light my heart used to be. Marla smiled, though her eyes glistened. He reminded us all. But not everyone understood. For every person inspired, there was another who felt unsettled. In the hardware store, a man named Grant muttered that it was Some rich fella's trick to make fools of decent people. His words echoed the skepticism of those who had long ago confused kindness for weakness. Still, even Grant couldn't escape the ripple. 2 days later, when his neighbor's roof started leaking, he showed up with a ladder and a bucket. Just temporary, he grumbled. But Marla would later find his name written on the chalkboard, signed simply, Grant reluctantly. Weeks passed. The rain returned in drizzles, but the diner stayed full. Strangers became regulars. Regulars became something better, neighbors. Marla kept the napkin behind the counter in a small glass frame, the ink slightly faded now but still legible. Some came just to see it, like pilgrims visiting a relic. They'd touch the glass gently, as though expecting warmth to seep through. Children started calling it the magic napkin. And maybe it was. Because wherever those words traveled, something good followed. A teacher left an envelope with $25 inside the diner door, labeled for lunches unpaid. A young couple left an anonymous check to fund new books for the library. A teenager returned a stolen bike to its rightful owner with a note that said, "Trying to be better. Thanks for the coffee." Small notebook of her own now, inspired by the strangers. She called it the Coffee Chronicles. Every night before closing, she would write a few lines. Who came in, what they gave, what they took with them. April 4th, a woman left $10 for the next man wearing sadness. April 6th, a girl with green hair cried into her hot chocolate. No one asked why. They just refilled her cup. April 7th, the napkin still hums. She didn't know what compelled her to keep track. Maybe it was reverence. Maybe it was responsibility. Maybe it was the faint hope that if she kept writing, the stranger might somehow find his way back. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the diner's windows like forgiveness, a letter arrived. It was addressed simply to the coffee diner, Brighton Hollow. Marla almost didn't open it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, familiar somehow. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in the same looping script she'd seen on the napkin. Kindness isn't a grand gesture. It's the daily rebellion against forgetting. Keep rebelling. H.W. Her hands trembled. H.W. The initials etched themselves into her heart like initials carved into an old tree. She folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it beside the napkin in its frame. The diner had become a kind of temple now, a sanctuary not of worship but of remembrance. That evening, as twilight brushed the rooftops with lavender light, Marla watched a group of teenagers laughing by the window booth. They were different from the ones she used to see, softer somehow, less guarded. One of them picked up a guitar and began to strum a tune no one recognized. Others hummed along. The melody wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Marla found herself humming too, under her breath. The sound was rusty at first, then freer, like a bird testing the sky after a long winter. When she turned off the lights that night, the diner felt alive in a way she hadn't felt since her first year of owning. Bursts of laughter seemed to linger in the booths. The smell of coffee, sugar, and rain hung in the air, wrapping the room like memory itself. A week later, Marla woke to find something pinned to the diner's door. A photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed the diner years ago when the sign had been new and the parking lot full of smiles. On the back, in the same neat handwriting, "I built this place once. You brought it back to life." She sank onto the steps, the morning sun washing her tears in gold. That night, she placed the photo beside the napkin and whispered, "We remember now." And Brighton Hollow did. Because that's how miracles work. Not with thunder, but with ripples that keep widening long after the hand that made them is gone. The napkin's words became the town's creed, printed on coffee cups and carved into a wooden sign above the door. You all forgot how good it feels to care. Only now the town has been remembered. It began as all searches do, not with certainty but with longing. The people of Brighton Hollow woke each morning expecting the spell to fade, but instead it deepened. The napkin behind glass had become a compass, and though no one said it aloud, they were all pointed toward one question that refused to rest. Who was he? The man without a name had left behind an aftertaste that no amount of coffee could wash away. He had come and gone like weather, leaving hearts rearranged and routines redefined. His absence had become a kind of presence, lingering in the way people held doors, the way they looked one another in the eye, the way the diner filled with light even on overcast days. Still, curiosity is a form of devotion, and devotion when unanswered becomes pilgrimage. By the second week, the town was restless. Marla's diner was busier than it had ever been, but beneath the warmth ran a current of wonder that occasionally bordered on obsession. They started with what he'd touched: the chair he sat in, the cup he used, the napkin he left. Marla had already been curator of a fragile faith, but some people wanted more. Tommy Haskins claimed he remembered the man's watch. A simple leather band, no brand visible. Military maybe, he said, as if the stranger's kindness required uniform discipline. Earl, the old postman, swore he'd seen that same man years ago delivering supplies to the old mill, back when the world still made sense. The teenager with headphones, now a daily visitor, said he'd overheard him humming a melody faintly familiar, maybe an old hymn, maybe something sadder. Marla listened, smiling, but said nothing. She had her own theory, and it wasn't one that could be proven by evidence. She believed he came from the same place kindness came from, and that place didn't issue addresses. Word reached beyond the hills before the week was over. A journalist from the county paper arrived one gray morning with a camera, a notebook, and the restless ambition of someone desperate for a story worth printing. Her name was Lila Hart. She had seen the diner trending on social media, photos of the napkin, captions full of awe. The town that remembered how to care, one headline read. She sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and asked, "Who started all this?" Marla wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. A man who didn't want to be found. Lila's pen paused. Everyone wants to be found. Marla shook her head. Not everyone. Some people just want to make sure they were worth remembering. It was the kind of answer that sounded poetic in print but impossible in a quote. Still, Lila stayed for hours, speaking to regulars, taking notes, listening as stories folded into one another, until the stranger felt more like a parable than a person. By the time she left, she had no photograph, no name, and yet a headline that felt right. The quiet man who rebuilt a town without saying a word. When the story was published 3 days later, it reached places Brighton Hollow had forgotten existed. Arriving for the diner, for the school, for the library. Letters poured in from strangers across the country, each containing some small echo of kindness. A retired nurse from Montana wrote, "I've been angry at the world for so long. Thank you for reminding me it's still capable of softness." A man in Chicago enclosed $50 and a note that read, "For the next person who forgets they matter." Marla read every one, her hands trembling slightly each time. "He's still working," she said one night, placing the letters in a shoebox she labeled HW Shadow. As the week stretched into a month, a small group began to form, the Finders as they jokingly called themselves. Earl, the postman, appointed himself the unofficial leader. "If anyone's left breadcrumbs," he declared, "I'll spot him." They met every Thursday evening after closing, gathered around the corner booth where the stranger had once sat. There was always coffee, always candlelight, and always a sense that they were reaching for something holy. Their search began pragmatically: old property records, news archives, missing persons reports. Brighton Hollow had never had much scandal to dig through, and yet, buried among the mundane bureaucracy of small-town history, they found traces, handwritten receipts from a decade ago, listing H. Wells Construction as the contractor for the diner's original renovation. Marla froze when she saw it. "H.W.," she whispered, remembering the initials on the letter. The group exchanged glances. Earl leaned back. "Wells. That name rings a bell. My daddy used to talk about a Henry Wells who owned half the block before the mill shut down." Tommy nodded. "He lost everything in that fire, didn't he?" Marla's breath caught. "The diner fire?" He nodded again. "Back in '05. Insurance mess. Place was closed for years before you bought it." The napkin's words echoed in her mind like an aftershock. "You all forgot how good it feels to care." She said diner differently, not just as her refuge, but as an inheritance from someone who had built it once, lost it, and left behind a debt that only kindness could repay. The following week, they began asking the oldest residents. Mrs. Crane, who ran the antique shop on Maple Street, remembered him faintly. "A good man," she said. "Had big dreams for this town. Built that diner so people could have a place to belong. But dreams cost money, and kindness doesn't always pay the bills." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "They said when he lost everything he just disappeared. Sold what little he had left and moved on." "Where?" Marla asked. Mrs. Crane shrugged. Does it matter? Men like that don't vanish. They just wait until the world needs them again. Her words settled over them like dust, light, but impossible to shake off. It was a Friday morning when the first real proof arrived. A small envelope, no return address, postmarked from 2 towns over. Inside was a faded photograph of a younger man, smiling proud, standing in front of a half-built diner. The sign above the door read Wells Cafe. On the back, written in the same familiar handwriting, "Once I built a place for people to gather. Then I forgot what it was for. Thank you for remembering for me. H.W." Marla held the photo to her chest. Her eyes blurred until the image dissolved into memory. "Henry Wells," she whispered. "You came home." Word spread faster than truth could keep up. Everyone wanted to claim a connection. Someone's uncle had worked for him. Someone's cousin had met him once at the supply yard. Someone's father owed him a favor. But for all the noise, there was no address, no obituary, no record of where Henry Wells might be now. It didn't matter, had already become his monument. They renamed the annual town fair Wells Day. They painted the diner's front door a deep coffee brown and hung a wooden sign that read, "The Wells Cafe, in honor of the man who remembered us first." Marla insisted on keeping the name Marla's Diner, painted faintly underneath, like a ghost signature. "He built it," she said. "But we kept it alive. Both names belong here." Spring came and with it more letters. None were signed, but everyone carried the same initials in the corner, H.W. Some contained donations, others contained nothing but words. The heart grows back one cup at a time. Forgiveness tastes better when shared. Brighton Hollow remembered. So can I. Each new note felt like proof that somewhere, the stranger was still watching, not from heaven, but from a distance close enough to hear the hum of gratitude. Marla would sit by the window each night after closing, a cup of coffee in her hands, reading the latest letter by candlelight. "Wherever you are, Henry," she'd whisper, "we're still keeping your promise." By summer, the search had softened into something else. No one needed to find him anymore, because they had found what he'd left behind, each other. The diner had become a meeting ground for people who didn't know they were lonely. Widows found company. Teenagers found mentors. The mechanic who once cursed the world fixed tires for free on Tuesdays. The preacher stopped preaching about heaven and started talking about what it meant to build it here. Even the skeptic Grant began leaving handwritten notes under coffee cups, simple ones that said things like "nice shirt" or "you matter." He never signed them, but everyone knew. The town, once gray and utilitarian, now pulsed with quiet color. Murals appeared on the walls. Window boxes bloomed. Doors that had once been locked for years opened again. And through it all, Marla kept the napkin framed on the wall, the ink fading with time but never losing its strength. You all forgot how good it feels to care. Now no one could. Late one August evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, a bus stopped. A man stepped out, tall, graying, with eyes that carried a peace earned the hard way. He wore no coat this time, only a flannel shirt and a smile that seemed both familiar and foreign. He looked at the street, at the windows glowing gold, at the laughter spilling softly from Marla's diner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a postcard. On one side, a photograph of the diner under moonlight. On the other, a single word written in looping script, "Remembered." He placed it in the mailbox and walked on, disappearing into the long evening road. No one saw him. No one needed to. Because in Brighton Hollow, the search had never really been about finding him. It had been about finding themselves. Morning came dressed in gold. Not the harsh kind that stabs through the blinds and wakes you before you're ready, but the gentle kind, the kind that tiptoes across countertops, brushes the rim of coffee mugs, and lingers like a polite guest waiting to be invited in. Brighton Hollow had learned how to wake slowly again. A year had passed since the man had come and gone, leaving behind nothing but a napkin, a note, and a legacy no one could quite explain. But time, as it tends to do, had not dulled his memory, it had seasoned it. His story no longer felt like a disruption, it had become part of the town's natural rhythm, woven into conversations like weather or crops or prayer. Children who hadn't even been born when he visited knew his name, or at least the myth of it. "Henry Wells," they'd whisper, like he was a fairy tale meant for grown-ups. A gentle ghost, a wandering saint, a man who bought coffee for everyone just because he could. But for Marla, the story had never been about the myth. It was about the man. She still worked the diner, same hours, same apron, though her step was lighter now. Her laugh too had changed, it carried less armor. The napkin still hung behind the counter in its frame, faded now to the color of old linen. Beneath it was the photograph, the one of a young Henry Wells standing before a diner under construction, hammer in hand, smiling at a future that had not yet betrayed him. Every day people came to see it. Not tourists, not exactly pilgrims of the ordinary. They'd stand in front of the frame as if afraid to disturb whatever holiness still lived in that glass. And every night, when the last table was cleared and the world went quiet, Marla would sit in the corner booth, the same booth Henry had once occupied, and write in her little brown notebook. April 15th, she'd jot. A woman paid for a soldier's meal. No one clapped. It was perfect. Or, May 2nd, the Doolin twins brought flowers for the nurse who took care of their father. I told them kindness blooms longer than tulips. Each entry ended the same way. Where are you now, Henry Wells? That morning began like any other. A soft drizzle brushing against the diner windows, the air smelling faintly of earth and rain and renewal. Earl was there, nursing his third coffee. Tommy argued with the jukebox again. And Mrs. Doolin had started her morning sermon about how teenagers didn't know how to talk to people anymore. Marla smiled at them all, loving the noise that once felt like burden. She was wiping the counter when the bell above the door chimed, a sound so ordinary it almost hid its importance. A man stepped inside. For a moment no one noticed. The conversation rolled on, cups clinked, laughter rippled. But then the air shifted just slightly, the way it does when the wind changes direction. Marla looked up. He was taller than she remembered. No, not taller, just older. His hair, now streaked with silver, curled at the edges of his collar. His coat was gone, replaced by a flannel shirt soft with wear. His hands, once clean and deliberate, were now marked by the honest dirt of labor. But the eyes were the same. Soft, steady, sad in the way wisdom is sad. She froze, the rag falling from her hand. Henry, she whispered before she shoved into a quiet smile. You remembered. And just like that, time folded. The rain outside paused, the diner stilled, and every unfinished sentence in her life found its punctuation. Marla didn't rush toward him. Neither did anyone else. It wasn't the kind of reunion that called for noise. He stepped forward, removing his hat with the gentleness of a man entering sacred ground. You kept it alive, he said, his voice roughened by years and distance. I tried, she replied, her voice trembling. We all did. He glanced around, the chalkboard filled with names, the walls lined with photos of smiling faces, the napkin in its frame. He reached out and touched the glass, his fingers trembling slightly. You made it better. Marla felt her throat tighten. We didn't do it alone. You started it. Henry shook his head slowly. No, he said. I just reminded you of who you already were. Word spread like sunlight, quiet, unstoppable. Within the hour the diner was full. People came not to gawk, but to see. To confirm that the legend was flesh, that Grace could still wear shoes and stand in front of them. Henry greeted them each with the same humility, remembering names he shouldn't have known, listening more than speaking. Earl reached across the counter, tears catching in the creases of his weathered face. You're the man who bought my coffee. Henry smiled. No, Earl. I'm the man who reminded you you were worth a cup. Tommy laughed through his shock. Thought you were a ghost, I did. Some days I was, Henry said, and everyone laughed with the tenderness reserved for truth. He stayed through the morning rush, eating pie, sipping coffee, listening as people told him what had happened since he left, the kindnesses, the letters, the days that felt lighter because he'd passed through them once. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried that stillness that had always belonged to him. I used to think I lost everything here, he said. But it turns out I just left too soon. As the crowd thinned and the afternoon light softened, Henry sat alone with Marla in the booth by his hand along the edge of the table. I built this place with every good intention, he began. Wanted it to be more than a diner. A place for people to rest from their battles. He smiled faintly. But then I started counting receipts instead of faces. Measuring days by dollars instead of stories. When the fire took it all, I thought maybe I deserved it. Marla listened, tears silent on her cheeks. I left, he continued. Told myself I was starting over. But you can't start over until you've gone back and apologized to what you abandoned. So one day I came back. Just to see what survived. And you bought coffee for everyone, Marla whispered. Henry nodded. I wanted to see if a small act could still ripple. If kindness could still move through broken places. He smiled sadly. You proved it could. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. You didn't lose this place, Henry. You just gave it time to remember you. He looked at her, eyes glistening. And you gave it a heartbeat again. When Henry stood to leave, Marla noticed the leather notebook in his hands, the same one he'd left behind years ago. You kept it, she said softly. He smiled. You kept me. He opened to a page near the end. Beneath the list of towns, Mercy, Choir, Forgiven, Garden, he had written one final word beside Brighton Hollow. Home. Marla pressed a hand to her chest. You came back to finish the story. He nodded. Stories don't end when we stop writing them. They end when we stop sharing them. She smiled through her tears. Then this one's never going to end. That evening, the town gathered outside the diner. Lanterns lined Main Street, glowing soft as fireflies. Someone brought a guitar. The first time in years brought her voice. Henry stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed at first. He looked at the faces illuminated by lantern light. The same faces that had once been tired, distant, numb. Now they glowed with something else. Hope. Marla stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. This town was asleep, she said. He didn't wake us with miracles. He woke us with coffee. With care. Laughter rippled through the crowd, gentle and reverent. She looked at Henry. And tonight we give that care back. One by one, people came forward, placing their hands on the diner door, whispering thanks not just for coffee, but for second chances. Earl left his postal bag by the steps, saying, For whoever still needs a message delivered. Mrs. Doolan laid down a tray of cookies, muttering, Still warm. Like my heart, apparently. And Tommy dropped a keychain with the diner's old logo. For the road ahead, he said simply. Henry stood still, overwhelmed. His eyes shimmered not with pride but with peace. The kind of peace that comes only to those who've been forgiven without asking. When the crowd dispersed, and the lanterns flickered low, Henry and Marla stood together beneath the neon glow of Marla's diner. Are you staying? She asked quietly. He looked down the long empty street. I don't think I can. There are other towns, other diners, other hearts that have forgotten. Marla nodded, the ache of understanding settling deep. Will you come back? He smiled faintly. When the world forgets again, maybe I will. He started to walk away, then stopped. Keep the coffee hot, he said. It always is. And then he was gone, into the same darkness from which he'd first arrived. But this time there was no sadness. Only the steady, glowing pulse of what he'd left behind. Weeks passed. Then months. The lanterns were packed away. The photo remained on, beautiful in its aging. Brighton Hollow carried on, not with fanfare but with quiet devotion. When a storm hit that winter, half the town lost power. But instead of waiting for help, people gathered at the diner with candles and soup. They called it Henry's night. Every storm after that they did the same, and on the first anniversary of his return, they added something new. A small plaque beside the napkin frame that read, He came back not to be seen, but to remind us to see each other. One morning months later, Marla opened the diner to find a letter slipped beneath the door. No stamp, no return address. Just 3 words written in that familiar hand. Still remembering you. Inside the envelope was a torn page from Henry's notebook. It listed 2 towns, names she didn't recognize, each followed by a single word. Mended. Beginning. Marla smiled through her tears. She turned the page over. On the back in small letters one more line. Home isn't where you end up. It's where you're remembered kindly. She placed the note beside the napkin, framed them together and whispered, Safe travels, Henry. Outside, the morning sun poured through the glass, lighting the diner like stained glass in a chapel built of kindness and caffeine. The first warning came as a low mutter from the sky, the kind that makes porch swings hush and dogs reconsider their arguments with squirrels. Then the rain arrived not as a visitor but as a decision, sheets of water drilling the street until the asphalt forgot its shape. Brighton Hollow knew storms, every small town does, But this one walked in wearing the old winter's temper and spring's impatience. The power flickered in a nervous Morse code and then surrendered, taking with it the hum that had become everyone's roommate. Candles appeared from drawers that had been pretending they were only for takeout menus and rubber bands. Flashlights discovered batteries that were both tired and brave. People looked at their own living rooms, decided they were too small for them, and drifted toward the only place that still felt calibrated to hold a crowd when the weather forgot its manners. They arrived at the diner in twos and threes, shoulders soaked, faces already softened by the shared emergency. Marla unlocked without ceremony. The neon over the door would have been useless even if it worked, but the bell above it remembered its job, giving each arrival the same small welcome it had given Henry the day he taught the town to breathe. The room filled with the quiet kind of noise, wet coats sighing on hooks, boots confessing their history to the floor, children whispering the way they whisper in chapels, as if God might eavesdrop on their bravery. Someone found the candle she kept under the counter for nights exactly like this, even though nights exactly like this never follow instructions. Flame found wick and the diner changed species, from chrome bright to honey warm. The light moved over faces as if painting them back into people. Shadows lifted their hems and behaved. Coffee? Marla asked out of habit, then laughed at herself. We'll make do. She brought out a dented percolator older than half the room and set it on a camp stove that had lived under the sink since the last blizzard whispered the possibility of need. Water boiled with an enthusiasm that felt like gossip. The smell rose and reminded the town of what it had promised to remember. Earl arrived cradling a small radio that ate batteries for sport. He turned the dial until voices from some distant hill threaded their way into the room, warning of downed lines and flooded culverts and patience required. Tommy followed with a toolbox and a grin, both inherited from men who measured competence in fixable minutes. Mrs. Doolin, who had sworn only last week that she was done cooking for crowds, pushed through the door with a stockpot balanced on her hip like a stubborn baby. Chicken and rice, she announced. It feeds opinions as well as people. Nobody asked if she needed help. Hands leapt to carry clear space, light more candles. By the time the first ladleful hit bowls, the windows were writing in rain and the parking lot had become a shallow, moving mirror. The diner filled beyond its memory of capacity. Teenagers who only months ago would have chosen solitude arranged a card table and began dealing kindness in the form of playing cards and bad jokes. Nurses on their off hours positioned themselves near the door with the calm soldiers bring to battlefields they refused to name. The choir director emerita sat, eyes closed, listening to the storm for pitch, humming under her breath the note she always used to call scattered voices into a chord. Grant came too, because even skeptics know where to report when a town collectively remembers itself. He stood near the window, cataloging the problems he could solve and those he could only accompany. When a boy with a skateboard under his arm hovered pretending not to be cold, Grant shrugged off his quilted jacket and handed it over without a speech. "You'll bring it back," he said. The boy nodded, and they both pretended the exchange was logistics. The percolator did its steady magic. People carried cups the way one carries news not yet ready for print. The storm had knocked out power. It had not silenced appetite. Bowls of soup moved through the room like blessings with handles. The chalkboard that usually kept tally of the coffee chain now carried a different heading, chalked quick and confident by the high school girl with the green hair. What we have / what we need. The left column filled as donations arrived from backpacks, pockets, and the peculiar bottom shelves of pantries. Tea bags, crackers, 2 ducks worth of dog food, a roll of candles with a label that insisted they smelled like spice. The right column filled 2 blankets, insulin pen needles, a phone charger if someone's battery had the arrogance to still be alive. A generator 3 doors down coughed awake and then reconsidered. Tommy and 2 younger men dragged it under the awning and pulled until it remembered that it had been born to try. When it finally settled into an agreeable hum, cheers rose, then softened, as if the room remembered it did not need to turn triumph into noise to prove it had occurred. Someone found the old mason jars, the ones that once held pickles nobody wanted to admit were too sour, and turned them into lanterns with floating wicks. The light made constellations of each table. Between them, people navigated with the courtesy sailors use when passing star to star. A child cried, the small, exhausted kind of cry that asks the world to decide something on its behalf. The hospice nurse lifted the baby as if she had been waiting all night for this exact vocation. The crying stopped because competence has a temperature that calms. She rocked, and her shadow on the wall swayed with her like an old lullaby. A gust pushed hard at the door. The bell objected, then laughed. Water slipped under the threshold and spread across the floor in a thin, cold suggestion. Without a word, a human chain formed. Mops, towels, a line of bodies passing buckets to the back door and empty ones forward. The motion became rhythm, the rhythm became relief, and the floor learned it was not alone. The radio announced that the bridge by the orchard had decided to forget its job for the evening. 2 families stranded on the far side would need shelter where they were. Someone from the thrift store, who always measured value in uses rather than dollars, stood up and said she had keys to the basement hall at St. Agnes. A handful of people volunteered to meet those families with blankets and the kind of jokes that keep questions from chewing on children. They left with umbrellas that looked ridiculous under such rain and the particular stubbornness that keeps towns from shutting themselves like books. The room shifted once more when the first song began, not intentionally. The choir woman's hum grew legs and walked to the center of her mouth. Abide with me tried itself on the air, but changed its mind halfway to the chorus. The words that arrived instead were simpler. Someone had taught them to children in the 70s and they had never entirely left. This little light of mine. The storm outside didn't register the affront. Storms are busy. Inside, the voices gathered courage until the sound pressed gently on the windows like hands. People who had not sung in years discovered their throats were not closed permanently. Even Grant mouthed the chorus, which for him was almost a confession. Between songs, stories multiplied. In outage light, people remember how to tell them without reaching for proof. A woman admitted she had been ashamed to come back to Brighton Hollow after a divorce, and then discovered that absence had not taught anyone to dislike her. A boy confessed he'd once stolen from the hardware store, and had been writing notes beneath coffee cups all summer to live down a memory he now allowed to exist without defining him. The retired coach described the phone call he'd made to the benched kid, and how the 2 men had met that afternoon and stood on the edge of the field until the grass decided they were forgiven. Nobody announced morals. The room understood repetition as a teacher. Hours lengthened and then folded in on themselves. The storm held the town in its wet fist and then very slowly loosened. With the generator, the percolator kept purring. With the candles, the room did not surrender its warmth. With each other, people forgot to be brave alone. Somewhere near midnight, a different kind of urgency walked in. A man carrying his mother on his breath, eyes wide with the fear that turns time into glass. She's diabetic, he said, voice level because panic had done its job and now competence would need to step in. Her fridge. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The nurses were already on their feet. The list on the chalkboard sprouted a new line. Insulin. A woman from the far booth, who usually hid her usefulness under modesty, said quietly that she had a spare kept cold in a camping cooler for Power's bad days. Within minutes the crisis had a plan, and minutes after that, the plan became history, and the woman sat down again like a person who expects no parade for doing what she was built to do. The storm lessened in practiced increments, the way grief lessens, not out of respect for those who carry it but out of the physics of weather. Children slept on benches and in laps. Earl tuned the radio to static for a while, then back to the voices who seemed surprised by their own perseverance. Tommy tightened a bolt that did not require tightening and then stopped himself, because sometimes fixing is just a way to avoid experiencing. At 2 a.m, the rain paused long enough for the town to inhale. People stepped outside to let the clean night air erase the smell of worry from their pores. The street shone without objection. Up the hill, a window threw a square of light into the dark, powered by a generator that had finally remembered how to be generous. The diner's door stayed open like a mouth between lines of a story. Back inside, Marla moved among her people with the slow assurance of a captain who trusts both ship and sea. She fixed a blanket on a sleeping child, poured coffee for a man who had stopped pretending it kept him awake, pressed an apple into the palm of a woman who had forgotten to eat while remembering too much. When she allowed herself a moment at the corner booth, she looked toward the frame on the wall. The napkin's words were almost invisible in that light, and yet she felt them as if they had been stitched into her apron. You all forgot how good it feels to care. The room around her was a rebuttal to forgetting. The night was writing itself into the town's biography. She closed her eyes and saw the photograph of a younger man holding a hammer as if it were a future. She thought of his return and his leaving, of his refusal to stay not out of indifference but because the route of his life seemed to be a braid of arrivals and departures. She remembered the most recent line in his letter, "Home isn't where you end up. It's where you're remembered kindly." The diner, overflowing with the work of remembering kindly, felt larger than its walls. Just before 3, wind rallied once more, as if the sky disliked being predictable. The door bucked. The bell protested and then forgave. The line of towels at the threshold darkened to their edges. The human chain reassembled without being asked, laughter replacing the groan people used to deploy when summoned by need. A late arrival brought a stack of quilts pieced by hands now buried but not gone. The quilts went over shoulders, knees, the backs of chairs. They turned the room into a family whose last name was not required. Then, as if remembering a scheduled ending, the storm changed its mind. The rain softened to a whisper full of apology. The world drew a breath and kept it. The radio announced clearings farther down the valley, the power company muttering about hours. The generator sputtered, decided it had done enough, and allowed dignity to be pulled from the wall. In the sudden quiet, the drip from the awning sounded like a distant metronome instructing the town on how to keep time. People did not rush to leave. Leaving would have been an insult to what the night had decided to accomplish. Instead, they lingered in those small end-of-gathering ways, collecting mugs, trading phone numbers with people who had been strangers at dusk, promising casseroles to problems that had not yet introduced themselves. The teenagers stacked chairs without being told. The nurse finally sat and let someone bring her soup. Grant stood with his hands in his pockets, considering the chalkboard, then wrote in the right-hand column under what we need, less reason to need lists. Someone added beneath it, but keep the chalk. Dawn practiced along the ridge, a thin suggestion of color bleeding into the stubborn dark. The candles guttered, one by one, as if bowing and leaving the stage to light better suited to day jobs. Marla walked to the door and stood there a moment, the air cool on her face, the night's breath still in her lungs. She imagined Henry somewhere far down some other main street, a coat folded over his arm, listening for the sound towns make when they decide to love each other with a little more intention. She imagined him smiling that half-smile of a man who trusts the seed will find soil even when he cannot stay to watch. Behind her, a small voice asked for more soup. She turned, and the day began in earnest. By 7, power crept back into the diner like a cat who pretends it was never gone. Lights blinked awake and immediately regretted their candor. The percolator retired with honors. The radio signed off. People stretched, blinked, promised to nap later and knew they would not. They cleaned the room the way people clean a sanctuary after a vigil, not to erase evidence, but to polish gratitude. Before anyone left, the chalkboard changed names again. Henry's Day, someone wrote at the top without debate. No date, no committee, no budget. Just the agreement that whenever the town was asked by weather or worry to gather, the diner would be the address and the password would be care. As they stepped out into a morning that smelled like second chances, Marla unpinned the napkin long enough to smooth its corners and press it briefly to her heart. She slid it back beneath the glass and whispered the only prayer she had ever been able to keep, "Let us remember." Out on Main, puddles reflected a sky tired of threatening. The mill's broken windows glistened like honest wounds. The church bell tested its voice. People walked home with blankets over their shoulders and the particular fatigue that feels like a receipt for having done the right kind of work. They would sleep at odd hours. They would answer phones all day. They would tell and retell the story until retelling became tradition. And when the rain returned some other year with some other temper, the town would not hesitate. Doors would open. Pots would boil. The chalkboard would fill and empty. Songs would remember their verses. The diner would overflow again, not from panic, but from a practiced abundance. For now the day had the soft shine of a thing rescued. Marla turned the sign to open even though it felt redundant. People came anyway, some to help, some to stand at the wall and read the old napkin as if it had new ink. In their faces she saw the storm's signature, a looseness around the eyes, a willingness to be interrupted, a readiness to be useful. She brewed the first official pot and thought of the ledger in Henry's notebook, the small square he had once left blank beside the town's name. She could not see the page, but she felt the pencil move. Whatever word he would have chosen, the night had earned it. Perhaps two. Remembered certainly. And something else older than sorrow and newer than sunrise. She poured coffee for the first customer of the new day and slid the cup across the counter with the care of a sacrament. Outside, the town adjusted its shoulders and stepped into its mourning. Inside, the bell chimed once, twice, like a reminder and a promise, and the story kept writing itself in steam. It was months before the letter arrived, months enough for spring to reassert itself and for Brighton Hollow to start believing that storms were only metaphors again. The town had fallen into a new rhythm of goodness, not dramatic, not noisy. It moved the way sunlight moves across a floor, slow, sure, constant. Every week brought another small proof that the night of the overflowing diner had not been a fluke but a rehearsal for who they had become. The coffee chain never ended. Sometimes people paid forward an entire breakfast. Other days it was just a few coins left under a saucer, accompanied by a napkin with a doodled heart or a word like brave. The chalkboard outlived its space. They hung a new one and then another, covering a whole section of wall now known as the Heart Line. Children pressed their palms against it for luck before heading to school. Tourists took photographs and, strangely, were quiet while doing it, as if the walls themselves insisted on reverence. Even Grant, who had long ago declared that miracles were for people with weak math, had begun volunteering at the library's reading circle. He still grumbled, but the grumble had lost its teeth. He claimed he was there for the free donuts, but the children knew he stayed for the stories. Marla had learned to stop counting customers. Instead, she counted conversations, laughter, pauses that held the weight of trust. She added new items to the menu, small offerings named after what the town had taught her. There was the second chance breakfast, the forgiveness pie, and a special called Henry's Pour, which was just coffee, strong black, served with a quiet expectation that something good might follow. She didn't expect another sign. The diner had become the sign itself. Then one morning she found an envelope on the doorstep, flattened slightly by dew. The handwriting was neat, almost shy. No return address, only 3 words on the front: to the people of Brighton Hollow. She carried it inside as if it were fragile. The regulars gathered without needing to be called. Earl fetched his glasses, Mrs. Doolan muttered about goosebumps, Tommy leaned forward until his elbows squeaked on the counter. Marla unfolded the single sheet and began to read aloud. Years ago I owned this diner. Lost it when I forgot people mattered more than profit. Thank you for proving I was wrong too late. The coffee was my apology. Henry Wells. For a heartbeat no one breathed. The air grew dense, charged with that ache that lives between sadness and grace. Tommy was the first to move. He reached up and tipped his cap, though Henry wasn't there to see it. Earl muttered something that sounded like a prayer. And Mrs. Doolan, who had once sworn she didn't cry for anything short of funerals, let her tears fall into her coffee as though that was where they belonged. Marla folded the letter, her hands trembling. He told us who he was, she whispered. After all this time. She walked to the wall and pinned the letter beneath the napkin, side by side like 2 verses of the same hymn. The crowd watched as if attending a ceremony none of them had planned but all of them understood. The rest of the day the diner hummed differently. People spoke in softer tones, as if he might still be listening. Someone brought lilies and left them on the counter. A child wrote thank you for the coffee in crayon and taped it beside the letter. By sunset, the glass frame had become an altar of paper and flowers and fingerprints, an accidental shrine to one man's repentance and a whole town's rebirth. News spread quickly, as it always did. The local paper reprinted the letter, calling it a message from the man who taught a town to remember itself. The article went everywhere, syndicated, reposted, whispered through social media by people who had never heard of Brighton Hollow but needed to believe such places existed. Letters poured in again, more than before. Strangers confessed regrets to a town they had never visited. Some sent money, most sent stories. One man wrote, I walked into a diner today and paid for a stranger's meal. I think you'd approve. Another said simply, I'm trying to remember how good it feels. Marla read each one aloud after closing, her voice catching on certain lines. She placed them all in a binder labeled the Wells Ledger. He gave us his name, she said one night, but not so we'd chase him, so we'd know what to call the feeling he left behind. Summer rolled in like forgiveness. The fields near the edge of town turned green again. The old mill, long since abandoned, was bought by a local cooperative who decided to turn it into an art space and community kitchen. They named it the Hollow Works. The first mural went up on its exterior wall, Henry's silhouette beneath a rain cloud, coffee cup in hand, the steam rising into the shape of a heart. At the bottom, in looping script, "You all forgot how good it feels to care." Every child in town helped paint the background. Even Grant showed up, paintbrush in hand, pretending he was only supervising. The mural became a landmark, something buses slowed down for, something lovers took photos under. And yet, amid the celebration, Marla felt a quiet ache. It can live side by side with longing. She found herself glancing at the door whenever it chimed, half expecting to see him again, the man who had made her believe in mornings. She'd catch herself smiling at nothing, whispering, "He's probably off somewhere making another town remember." Then one evening, as the diner emptied and twilight draped itself across Main Street, she noticed a familiar shape sitting at the edge of the booth where Henry had once written in his notebook. A young woman, travel-worn and gentle-eyed, was nursing a cup of coffee. Marla approached. "You okay, hon? You've been sitting there a while." The woman looked up and smiled. "I was told I'd find him here." Marla blinked. "Find who?" "Henry Wells. My grandfather." The woman's voice was calm, but her eyes shimmered with something between pride and ache. "I saw the letter in the paper. My mother used to tell me stories about this place. I never knew they were true." The diner fell still. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to hesitate between seconds. Marla sat down opposite her. "He came back, you know. Last spring. Stayed for pie. Told me we'd remembered how to smile." The woman's lips trembled into a soft laugh. "That sounds like him. Always trying to make things right, even when he thought he couldn't." Marla poured another cup. "He did more than that. He gave us back to ourselves." They talked long into the night. The granddaughter told her about Henry's last years. A small cottage by the coast, a garden he tended, the notebook he carried everywhere. He'd filled it with towns and names and single words. "Mercy Braver awake home." He'd told her once, "Every place you go either takes something from you or gives something back. Brighton Hollow gave me back myself." By the time the young woman left, dawn had started to blush over the hills. Before she went, she handed Marla a small parcel. "I wanted this to come back here," she said. "He said the story wasn't his alone anymore." Marla opened it after the door closed. On the last page, in the same familiar hand, Henry had written, "For every town that forgets, there is a Brighton Hollow waiting to remind it." She pressed her fingers to the ink as if touching his pulse. The air around her seemed to hum again, that same quiet resonance the diner had carried the day he first walked in. She placed the notebook beside the framed napkin and letter, completing the trinity of their shared redemption. Later that morning, as the first customers trickled in, she added a new line to the chalkboard. "Remembered. Braver. Home." The words stayed there through summer, through autumn, through the next storm and the next, untouched by time or chalk dust. Years would pass before anyone realized that Henry's granddaughter had stayed in town. She bought a small house near the orchard, planted a garden like her grandfather's, and started working at the diner. She didn't talk much about him, but sometimes, when the sky turned the same pewter gray that had once ushered him through those doors, she'd glance toward the corner booth and smile like she'd just heard a familiar voice. And maybe she had. Because every so often, on mornings thick with mist, the bell above the door would ring without opening, and the smell of rain and coffee would drift through the room, soft, comforting, unmistakable. People would look up, half expecting, half hoping. Marla would just smile and pour another cup. "He's just checking in," she'd say. "Making sure we still remember." Brighton Hollow did. The memory was in their habits now, in the extra cup poured, the door held open, the hand steadying another's. Henry Wells had built the diner, lost it, found it again, and finally set it free. And in doing so, he'd built something much larger, a town that no longer needed saving because it had learned how to save each other. No plaque, no monument, no grave bore his name. But every act of quiet decency in Brighton Hollow was a syllable of his eulogy, and every dawn was a small resurrection. And somewhere, perhaps by a coastal cottage where the gulls call names into the wind, a man might still be carrying another napkin, another note, ready to remind the next forgotten place how good it feels to care. They chose a day without drama, the kind of day towns forget to celebrate, a Saturday that woke slow and polite, the air neither brave nor afraid, the sky a clean sheet waiting for handwriting. The chalkboards were wiped, the coffee was ground, The napkin in its frame wore the soft dignity of a relic that knows it has already done its work. Marla arrived before light, as she always had, key turning in the lock with a click that sounded like a page turning. Her hair had silvered into truth, her hands steadier not because they were young but because they had long ago made friends with purpose. She set the percolator singing and opened the windows to let the morning in. It smelled like cut grass and neighborly intentions. They had been calling it Henry's Day for a while, but this one carried a different gravity. Not the weight of ceremony, but the hush of a decision kept. No flyers, no speeches promised, just a message chalked on the door in the granddaughter's looping hand. If you need a place to belong today, we saved you a seat. The first to arrive were the ones who always arrived. Earl with a stack of envelopes rubber-banded like a bouquet, the choir director emerita in her coat that remembered both weddings and winters, Tommy with a toolbox he might not open, the nurse who had stopped introducing herself because the town had learned her name. They took their places as if the diner were a hymn, and they the familiar lines. The bell above the door, a modest instrument, gave each entry its same small welcome, impartial and sincere. By 8, the room had begun to glow, not from electricity, though the bulbs behaved, but from the concentration of gentleness. Children traced spirals on the condensation of the windows and signed them with their initials like artists. Teenagers, those tentative diplomats between worlds, stacked chairs and extra cups without performing their generosity for applause. A couple who had been arguing all week sat side by side and chose quiet as their truce. Even Grant stood at the Heartline wall and wrote without grousing a simple sentence under what we have. Enough to share. At 9, the granddaughter took her place behind the counter. She had learned the choreography of the room the way some people learn a language by loving someone who speaks it, listening first, answering only when the vowels felt right. She polished the glass of the frame that held the napkin and the letter and the last page from the notebook, then stepped back as if bowing to an elder. When she poured the first cup, she steadied the saucer with the patience of someone who had watched a whole town relearn its manners. By 10, people were arriving from other towns. Word had traveled not as a headline but as an invitation passed hand to hand, story to story. They came with curiosity but left it at the door like umbrellas. A man from 3 counties over brought a wooden sign he'd carved in his shop between fixing grandchildren's toys. You are welcome. He placed it above the doorway and brushed a thumb across the letters, as if to make the word truer with touch. Marla watched it all the way a farmer watches weather, trusting the sky but ready to move a tarp if the day forgot itself. She wore the apron with the repaired strap, the one that stitched her to the room like a line in a poem. When she finally sat a minute in the corner booth, she placed her palm on the table where he had once rested his own. The wood remembered. She could feel it, some residue of arrival, a warmth that was not temperature. No one had planned a program, so one emerged. The choir woman began with a note held just long enough to collect courage, then let it bloom into song. Know him this time. Something simpler, almost childish, the melody everyone knew though no one could name its author. Voices joined with the humility of people who have learned that singing is not about accuracy, but about belonging. The sound pressed up against the windows and the world pressed back with sunlight. A boy stood, 12 at most, and cleared his throat with the audacity of the young and the authorization of the room. Last year, he said, I got in trouble for taking a thing that wasn't mine. Mrs. K gave me coffee and a job wiping tables instead of calling my mom. That's all. He sat, face steady, as if he had delivered weather. The room did not clap. It did something quieter, made space around his confession and let the air hold it until it turned from shame into soil. The nurse told a story about a night when the power went out and the diner overflowed, and how a jar of insulin and a stranger's steady hand had kept a life stubborn against statistics. A woman who ran a daycare said the coffee chain had paid for lunches the month the rent and the car and the cracked tooth had all conspired. She pulled a crumpled $5 from her pocket and tucked it under a stranger's saucer with the swift grace of someone returning a borrowed book. Earl read aloud a letter from a lighthouse keeper on a cold coast, who had never been to Brighton Hollow but swore the light was brighter now where he lived because of a story he'd heard. By noon, the chalkboard's left column had become a litany. What we have: time, truck beds, 2 spare bedrooms, rides to the clinic on Thursdays, a freezer full of casseroles with names that did not reveal their contents, patience for people who need 5 extra minutes, cash if you ask without apologizing, forgiveness if you need it and if you don't too. The right column, what we need, remained shorter on purpose, not because the town lacked needs but because it had learned to ask carefully. Under blankets someone wrote listening in small, careful chalk. The granddaughter slipped out and returned with a narrow box wrapped in butcher paper and twine. She placed it on the counter beside the frame and waited until the murmur of the room softened into readiness. "He sent it a long time ago," she said. "Said it wasn't to be opened until a day like this, when the room was full of itself." Hands found the knots and released them. The paper unfolded like a map that already knew the route. Inside lay a plaque, not brass or showy, just walnut warmed by oil and patience, letters carved with a hand that respected wood, a place built for rest and repair. She lifted it. The room breathed the way rooms do when words find their address. No one asked where to hang it, they knew. Above the corner booth, where strangers had learned their names again, where storms had been renamed gatherings, where the first quiet had been ordered and served without a flourish. Tommy found the studs without a stud finder because experience is a compass. The plaque took its place as if the wall had been waiting. There was a moment then, small, easily missed, in which the bell above the door offered a chime though no one had entered. People looked up by instinct. Marla smiled without surprise. "He's on time," she said, and poured a cup for the empty place at the corner booth. She set it down with the same care she gave to any guest. Steam fingerprinted the light, curled and disappeared. The cup stayed full. A promise poured into porcelain. Afternoon settled itself. Sun rolled across the floor in generous rectangles. The mural at the old mill sent its color down the block as if paint could travel. The stories kept coming, not stacked but braided. A pair of teens admitted they had stopped a fight behind the grocery, not because they feared trouble, but because they respected the street. The librarian spoke of a patron who returned a book 30 years late with an apology baked into banana bread. Grant, cornered by affection, confessed that he had saved every note he'd ever found beneath his saucer and kept them in a shoebox labeled "used later." Food appeared the way food appears when people decide to feed each other, without plan, in quantities that defy math. It arrived in pots and foil, in Tupperware faintly stained with the memory of tomatoes, in bakery boxes with handwriting that apologized for the frosting. The counter became a topography of generosity. Someone carved slices, someone ladled, someone washed dishes as they appeared and set them to dry in rows that looked like a congregation waiting quietly for the next service. The granddaughter read from the notebook, not the famous page but the middle where the handwriting loosened on lonely roads. "Home," Henry had written once, years before the first return, "is made of people who remember your particular weight and make a chair sturdy enough to hold it." She closed the book and placed her palm on the cover as if to keep the words from escaping and exhausting themselves. The sun tipped toward the west. Evening rehearsed its colors on the undersides of clouds. Marla slipped away to the tiny office and opened a drawer that stuck the way drawers stick when they are full of the past. Inside lay a photograph she had not yet given to the wall. A man younger than the legend, older than hope, standing outside a half-built diner with a hammer and a half-smile. She carried it out and set it beneath the plaque. "For the original contractor," she said. The laughter that followed was the kind that mends. As twilight folded itself over Main Street, people lit the lanterns. The same jars from the storm, the same wicks, perhaps, or their cousins, floated on pools of oil and made little suns on each table. The choir woman raised her hands without realizing and drew another note out of the room. It rose and found others, and together they wove something that was not quite a song but more than silence, a sound sturdy enough to be leaned on. And then came the quiet part, the part after abundance when a day reveals what it meant. Marla stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour and fingerprints, and looked out at the town she had watched both harden and soften, both forget and remember. She did not think of herself as a keeper or a saint. She thought of herself as a woman who had opened a door every morning and kept a pot warm and let people bring what they had. Tears stung in the honest way, not as drama but as gratitude finding its spillway. She thought of him, coat dripping on that first morning, the way he had ordered quiet and received it, the napkin weighted by a bill and a sentence that had done what neither law nor lecture could do. She did not ask for his return. She asked for his itinerary to be full. A breeze slipped through and touched the bell. It chimed once, twice, like a friend knocking on the idea of a door. A hush fell that was neither nervous nor expectant, just ready. Marla lifted her cup and then, because the moment asked for it, She lifted the stranger's cup too and held them both as if to balance a story between hands. To the man who remembered us, she said. And to the people who refused to forget. The cups touched the air and then the saucers. The room exhaled. Conversation resumed in the language they had perfected, kindness without spectacle. People left in ones and two and stayed in groups that did not notice time. Children, drowsy and sugared, leaned into parents who did not resent the wait. Promises were made, good ones, the kind that add errands to calendars and relief to lives. The lanterns burned lower. The granddaughter wiped the counter and then unwiped it, just to keep her hands busy. The plaque watched over the booth with the patience of wood. When the room had thinned to the last faithful few, Earl approached the wall and taped up a fresh envelope beneath the frame. For whoever writes the next letter, he said. So they won't have to scrounge for a stamp. Laughter again, light as spoons. Outside, the town looked younger than evening usually makes a town look. The mural at the mill wore the night like a jacket. The church bell decided the hour and then forgave itself for being slightly wrong. A dog argued with the moon and lost politely. Somewhere far off, a freight train reminded the valley that leaving is also a kind of belonging. Marla turned the sign to close because it was a habit, though nothing felt closed. She did the last small tasks that had always ended her days, counting the till not to worship numbers but to bless them, stacking saucers into little proud columns, straightening a chair that preferred to sit at an angle. Just before the frame, and for a moment the glass held more than paper. It held the room's reflection, a collage of faces that had learned to be unafraid of one another. She touched the napkin's corner through the glass. You all forgot how good it feels to care. The sentence no longer felt like a criticism. It felt like a diagnosis that had led to a cure. She whispered, "We remember." The granddaughter flipped the last switch. Darkness softened everything into one shape. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. The door closed with an old friend's click. Out on the sidewalk the air had cooled. People were walking home slower than they had arrived, because people who have been held by a room try not to rush the re-entry. Porch lights bloomed open. Screen doors negotiated with hinges. The town settled. And in the corner booth, where a cup still steamed by agreement, the rising line of heat wrote temporary poems into the night. They vanished as all beautiful things do. Having done their job, it began with a man no one recognized. He walked into the diner one rainy morning, ordered one coffee, and paid for every stranger inside. No name, no reason. Just a quiet act that left the whole town buzzing. By the time they learned who he really was, the coffee had gone cold, and their hearts were forever warm. Years later, on a day stitched from ordinary light, they poured a cup for him anyway and let it steam beside their own. Proof that a single kindness, properly remembered, can outlive the hand that offered it. The diner still stands on Main Street, the paint a little paler, the bell a little softer, but when dawn spills through the windows it paints the corner booth in gold. And some mornings, when the rain returns just right, when kindness hums beneath the noise, steam rises from an untouched cup, and it almost looks like someone's there. Not gone, just ahead of them, waiting for the next soul who forgot how